Hello, friends. I hope you're doing well today. Uh, Today I visited QTech Library and borrowed this book, uh, the collected works of E.M. Satow. It's actually Kwaiwa Hen, 25 Exercises in the Edo Colloquial, but it's also volume one of a 12-volume series uh, published by Ganesha of Bristol and Editions Synapse of Tokyo in 1998. And at the beginning, there is an introduction to Satow's life by uh, Dr. Nigel Brailey, who has passed away. He was a professor at the University of Bristol, and he was a fellow traveller in the volumes of Satow for many years. And so today, what I want to do is to read his introduction as a kind of memorial to him. Okay, so here we are. Let's see if we can get this to the right point. Oops. I think I have to make it a bit smaller so that I can see all of the page. All right, so here we go. Introduction. Ernest Satow's last 2 decades after 1906 were so remarkably different from what went before that this must be seen as the critical turning point in his life. The only moment to really revival it occurred back in 1861. This was when his most admired elder brother, Edward, brought home Lawrence Oliphant's 2-volume narrative of the Earl of Elgin's mission to China and Japan. For it was this book which he later claimed persuaded him that the only recently accessible Japan was a country where the sky was always blue, where the sun shone perpetually, and where the whole duty of man seemed to consist in lying on a matted floor with the windows open to the ground towards a miniature rockwork garden in the company of rose-lipped, black-eyed and attentive damsels. In short, a realized fairyland. It was this that was supposed to have set him off on his career in the East through to 1906. Up to 1861, Satow seems to have experienced a conventional enough mid-Victorian middle-class childhood and youth. He lived in parts of East London that were then quite well-to-do, played cricket and had English girlfriends. Admittedly, both his family and education were somewhat unusual. As the eighth child of 11, he was also the eldest of the 4 little boys who brought up the rear of the family, and was generally rather doted upon by his elder sisters. By contrast, he had a fairly strict Congregationalist mother, while his Swedish-German immigrant merchant father, who wielded a much-feared cane known as the Black Friend, operated substantially within London's German community, and some of Satow's siblings were part German educated. Yet Ernest seems to have developed into his father's favourite, or at least supposed he did. Whether due more to talent or application, which became ever more evident, he made the most of his years at what he later called the Pestalozzi style Newcombe School in Lower Clapton, and then Mill Hill School. For the most part, he studied languages, classical and modern, mathematics and music, and a school scholarship entitled him to attend lectures at University College London, in Victorian times a notorious home of religious scepticism. There, as a mere 18-year-old, he completed a degree in a rush prior to taking up a Foreign Office student interpretership in preference to continuing on to Cambridge. His elder brother Edward, already involved in business with the future philanthropist Sir Thomas Hanbury at Shanghai and to die there of cholera in 1865, evidently inspired Ernest's interest in the East. But Japan was the only place for Ernest. Thus, as he recalled in his diary on the 4th of November 1911, this day 50 years ago, I said goodbye to my father and mother at Southampton and sailed in the P.O. steamer Indus for Alexandria on my way to Japan. Early days in Japan. Some of Satow's more striking sentiments appear in more than one place. In 1893, for instance, he declared, "Those years from 62 to 69 were the most interesting portion of my life. Then I lived, Now I seem to vegetate. He was required first to report to the British legation in Peking and only arrived in the foreign settlement at Yokohama in September 1862. A fortnight later, the British merchant Richardson was cut down outside Yokohama by samurai in the train of the Satsuma regent Shimazu Hisamitsu, his companions barely escaping with their lives. And these years were littered with such incidents. The year before, Henry Huskins, the Dutch secretary to the American consul Townsend Harris, had been similarly murdered, and 2 soldiers had been killed in a Japanese attack on what had become by then the British legation. In February 1863, the legation was burnt down by incendiaries. 2 British Army officers were murdered at Kamakura in November 1864, and in May 1867, Satow himself, with a companion, was fortunate to survive a night attack at an inn where they were staying. Thereafter, 2 sailors were killed at Nagasaki in August 1867. In February 1868, the whole foreign community at Kobe was threatened. In March, a boatload of Frenchmen was massacred, and shortly after, Sir Harry Parkes, the British minister, suffered an attack en route to an audience with the Tenno, later translated as Emperor, in which 9 of his escort were wounded, and this list is far from exhaustive. Many of these incidents were caused merely by odd pairs of samurai, but this was an era of war in Japan, both external in the form of British-led punitive naval attacks on both the 2 main southwestern clans in 1863 and 1864, each accompanied by Satow, and civil war. Eventually, both these clans, that's Satsuma and Choshu, sought to overthrow the 2.5-century regime of the Tokugawa shoguns, kings, in inverted commas, which had brought much prosperity to the country as no longer able to defend Japan's sovereignty and sakoku, closed country policy. And even after they were victorious in 1868, strife continued for some time. A sad tradition of political assassination that by 1832 was to claim the lives of 4 prime ministers and a variety of other prominent Japanese had already commenced before Satow's arrival, with the death of the regent Ii Naosuke in 1860. And above all, the loyalist anti-foreign cause of Sonno Joi in defense of their sacred and formerly isolated archipelago heightened tensions and made Japan a very dangerous place for foreigners, certainly those who were not content to confine themselves to the settlements such as Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki. Despite the idyllic picture he draws at the outset of his main memoir, that's A Diplomat in Japan, Satow had brought with him a revolver from England and soon concluded that even that was of little use against assailants who were likely to have chosen their moment carefully. This was a case not of a bullet, but a sword with one's name on it. Of course, Satow was one who wanted to explore. These were also the years when he learnt the language and got to know Japan as probably no Westerner had ever done before him. Also, thanks in part to his official position, culminating in appointment as Japanese language secretary to the British legation in 1865, he was able to make the acquaintance of many leading Japanese, in particular those emerging through the so-called Meiji Restoration. For instance, the 2 incendiaries of the British legation, Ito Hirobumi and Inoue Kaoru. Satow contributed to the myth of a restoration by publishing articles in the local English-language press supporting the claims of the Tenno to a power he was never in fact to realize, which some Japanese took to indicate the policy of Sir Harry Parkes. However, later on, Satow invariably referred to the restoration as a revolution, albeit a kind of middle-class displacement of the existing hoary oligarchy by a new set of men. It also appears that he enjoyed a lively private life in these years, although in view of his later discretion, this may have been exaggerated. For Satow, the 1870s were rather different. To begin with, in 1869, he was awarded a long home leave, during which he spent some time in Paris and visited Germany twice, once with his parents and again with his father alone. By the time of his next leave, his father was dead. Yes, his father died in 1874. Back in Japan, the atmosphere had changed. Opportunities for youthful initiative had diminished, and the official work became more mundane. Thus, Satow sought instead to apply his linguistic skills to scholarship as an early member of the Asiatic Society of Japan and became a great bibliophile. In 1875 to 76, he was again granted extended leave, during which he paid a first visit to Italy and also spent some months at the University of Marburg, commencing the study of law, which he had previously declined to do. By this time, his youngest brother was training as the eventual family lawyer, that's Samuel Satow, ending as a master to the High Court. On his next return to Japan, Satow was at once given by Parkes the fascinating job of going down to Kagoshima in the southern island of Kyushu to investigate the developing political tension there. Walking across the island from Nagasaki, Satow met up with one of his old acquaintances, the great Satsuma partisan Saigo Takamori, before the latter marched north with his army of discontented ex-samurai. Shortly after, having been repulsed by the garrison of Kumamoto Castle, the rebels were confronted by the new regime's new conscript army and defeated, and Saigo committed seppuku, harakiri, suicide, ritual suicide. However, in 1878, he was in a sense revenged through the assassination in Tokyo of his great rival Okubo Toshimichi, an event which even Satow welcomed. On his first arrival in Japan in 1862, Satow had become at once an active diary writer. After 1869, he seems to have lost his enthusiasm for it, and the entries became quite desultory for a while. However, the Kagoshima visit prompted renewed activity in this respect, which never again went into real decline. The diaries of this period and various surviving letters portray him as an increasingly committed and self-satisfied scholar who believed he spoke Japanese as well as any native. He was closely involved with his Northern Irish consular colleague W.G. Aston and also Basil Hall Chamberlain, who had arrived as a globetrotter in 1873 and then stayed on teaching at the new University of Tokyo, first as a professor of English and then of Japanese. Together they formed the triumvirate of great early British Japanologists. Finally, this was also the period when Satow, now living inside the Ushigome Gate in Tokyo, commenced a family with a Japanese woman called Takeda Kane, which he kept quite secret from his relatives in England. Takeda family tradition claims a daughter born in the early 1870s who soon died. The sons who were to survive were Eitaro, born in 1880, and Hisakichi, later known as Hisayoshi, in 1883, after Satow had left on a further English leave. This time, Satow quickly settled down to renewed legal studies for the bar, passing the examinations with distinction in the autumn. Otherwise, his mind was still on Japan, meeting Ito Hirobumi, one of his old friends, and by now Japan's chief minister, en route to the continent to investigate European constitutional systems, particularly Germany's, as a model for his country. And through Mori Arinori, the Japanese minister in London, he was introduced as an expert on Shinto to Herbert Spencer. By the time his legal studies were complete, he was busy with a lengthy and convoluted memorandum for the new British minister in Tokyo-elect, Francis Plunkett. This proposed the elimination of British consular courts' extraterritorial jurisdiction in Japan, an infringement on local sovereignty stemming from the so-called unequal treaties signed back in the 1850s, already sought by the Japanese for more than a decade. Plunkett, however, seems to have held back this sensitive document as likely to embarrass Satow's career prospects, which now took a marked turn for the better. The Emerging Diplomat. An approach to Satow by Philip Currie of the Foreign Office back in 1876 inquiring of him what policy he would follow in Japan if he were British minister there, doubtless had already sowed the seed of ambition and opened up the possibility of his transfer out of the consular corps to the diplomatic branch of the Foreign Office, that is. At all events, by 1883, as Assistant Under Secretary, Currie, now Sir Philip, was deputy head of the Foreign Office and in a position to exert influence. In December 1883, with his return to Japan just weeks away, Satow was persuaded to apply for the post of agent and consul general at Bangkok as a likely stepping stone back to the legation in Tokyo. Better still, the Foreign Office was already considering elevating the post to a legation itself, similarly headed by a minister. And indeed, unbeknown to Satow himself, by early February 1885, he was already under consideration for the transfer back to Tokyo in consequence of the death of Parkes in Peking, and the proposal to replace him with Plunkett transferred from Tokyo. However, Plunkett declined to move except back to a European appointment, and Satow's official return to Japan was thereby to be postponed 10 years. Further, he was to find himself thereafter, at least until Currie's appointment to the British Embassy at Constantinople, obligated to a chief with whom he was in no great political sympathy. And ultimately he was to be frustrated to find, like others before him such as Alcock and Parkes, that transfer to a diplomatic role in the rather specialist foreign service establishments of Eastern Asia could still prove effectively a dead end. Certainly there was no guarantee of promotion to the plum postings in Europe. However, until his transfer from Tokyo to Peking in 1900, he was always to maintain that the legation at Tokyo was the summit of his ambition. At all events, on arrival in Bangkok in April 1884, Satow took up his new responsibilities with great energy. It was hardly as if Siam, in diplomatic relations with Britain since 1856, had ever before attracted a man of such ability. For 15 years, 1864 to 79, Britain's Siam policy had been directed by Thomas Knox, an ex-Indian Army officer, subsequently mixed up in Siamese politics partly by intermarriage, and this had eventually brought on his enforced retirement. By contrast, Satow's immediate predecessor, W.G. Palgrave, transferred from the Balkans, assumed such a grand and costly pose that he was quickly disciplined with a move to Uruguay. He had at least been responsible for the idea of elevating the anomalous office of agent and consul general to minister. The feature of Satow's stint in Bangkok was his commitment to the independence of Siam, by the end of 1885 the sole remaining sovereign state in Southeast Asia. Apparently this was partly to facilitate a trial run for his favourite idea of abolishing extraterritoriality, ultimately to be applied in Japan too. But it involved frustrating the ambitions not only of the French colonial administration in Saigon, but also its British equivalent in Singapore, increasingly supported not only by the Colonial Office in London, but even Sir Philip Currie at the Foreign Office. Coming at a point which arguably marks the beginning of the decline of the West in Asia, it can be said that Satow succeeded in his broader aim, though not the narrower one, of restoring general judicial sovereignty to Siam. That had to await efforts by the Siamese themselves to bring their legal system in line with the West over the next half-century. And he escaped the censure he might otherwise have attracted for his efforts, ceding responsibility for the policy to the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, Lord Salisbury himself. But when Satow returned to London on sick leave in 1887, Salisbury seems to have taken the view that it was best that he did not return to Bangkok. His health went into temporary collapse as a consequence of malaria and considerable weight loss, and it was decided that he should be moved to a post that permitted recuperation. When, after nearly 2 years' home leave, he followed the recently deceased Palgrave out to Montevideo in 1889, he seems to have felt himself that his career was nearly over at the early age of 45. Indeed, the years 1888 to 93 form the nadir of his official career, and he fell into a state of some depression. Admittedly, his spell in Siam was apparently also one of considerable scholarly and literary activity. A whole room at the legation in Bangkok was devoted to his Japan library. He compiled what was probably the first serious bibliography of literature about Siam, and also wrote a study of its historical relationship with Japan. He produced an account of his 4-month journey to the north of the country, never published until very recently, and always claimed that he wrote the greater part of his later Diplomat in Japan at this time, only to put it too aside. And ever after, almost uniquely, he was one to stress the comparability of things Siamese with those of China and Japan, the three surviving independent East Asian countries. But late 1887 saw him commence work in libraries that took him all round the Western Mediterranean in early 1888 and culminated later in the publication of his Jesuit mission press in Japan. Even in the 1870s, he had begun to wish he could stay at home permanently. While in Siam, he had begun to debate the advantages of retiring as a diplomat. And also in 1888, he underwent a kind of religious revelation, which for a decade after left him debating full conversion to Catholicism in emulation of his friend Chamberlain. When two nieces who had accompanied him to Montevideo returned home, he seems to have felt abandoned and alone. And when inquired of from London regarding a transfer across the River Plate to the more prestigious legation of Buenos Aires, he showed no interest, only recovering his spirits somewhat in 1893. However, there was to be a final crescendo to his official career, which commenced with a sudden invitation from London in June 1893 to transfer to the essentially Oriental Sultanate of Morocco in North Africa. Also, physically fit again, he seized the opportunity with enthusiasm and spent much of his 2 years there away from his comfortable legation at Tangier on a mission to the capital city of Fez, trying to help solve the problem of the succession to the late Sultan. Unlike in Siam, he had to deal not only with the French, but also the Spanish, Italians, and Germans, all interested in the fate of the country, and was finally rewarded for his achievements in May 1895 with special selection for the legation back in Tokyo. Nor was this to be for him any sort of poisoned chalice, not even as a result of the almost immediate supersession of the Liberals, who had negotiated away extraterritoriality and then appointed him, by the Tories returning under Salisbury, undoubtedly much less sympathetic to Japan. The circumstances which had caused the Foreign Office to drag Satow away so suddenly from the sensitive enough problems of Morocco were the aftermath of the 1894-95 First Sino-Japanese War. Satow himself seems to have viewed the Japanese as guilty of adventurism, and having provoked the triple intervention of Germany, Russia, and France in April 1895 to divest them of their prize war booty, the Liaotsung Peninsula, commanding the approaches to Peking. But the intervention, taken without London's approbation and implicitly in conflict with its open-door policy in China of the previous half-century, was also destructive of British preeminence in the East. While Satow came increasingly to fear that if Japan again provoked a similar response, Britain under a Tory government would after all cooperate with the other powers against Japan, the remarkable fact is that his final 5 years in Tokyo were instead to set the scene for Anglo-Japanese cooperation and the 1902 alliance. This was to prove the most significant and influential international commitment made by Britain in decades, if also a recognition of her declining power like the Entente Cordiale which followed it. Here in Tokyo, too, Satow was fully occupied in his dealings with his European colleagues, although his old personal friendships with almost the whole Japanese leadership dating back to the 1860s made his job very much easier. If London was unfriendly, they trusted him, and he also found abundant time to resume close relations with his sons. The Japanese were even urging him to put to the Foreign Office the question of his elevation to ambassador rank, though he demurred, perhaps unwisely. When once again he was dragged away in 1900, relations were set fair, and the negotiations of the alliance, pursued by others during 1901, went with barely a hitch. However, his hopes of writing during these years as a follow-up to the Jesuit mission press in Japan, the classic study of the so-called Christian century in Japan, got no further than a preliminary chapter, and the task was therefore left to Charles Boxer half a century later. But in 1900, the Hakluyt Society was to publish his edition of the Journal of John Saris, the pioneer first-hand account of Japan in English. Minister in China. By now, taking on the character of the Foreign Office's Far Eastern troubleshooter, Satow's final responsibilities following the Boxer War, or rebellion as it's sometimes called, were to prevent China's dismemberment through the 1900-1901 Peking International Conference, and to try to mediate the growing Russo-Japanese tension, and when it ended in war, to assist in resolving it by negotiation. Also, he was to help settle other issues which came to a climax in these years, such as the fate of Tibet. In the process, he enjoyed diplomatic prominence of a sort that hitherto had not come his way, but after another home leave, much fated, in 1903, and an appointment with Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, and his officials at Simla on the return trip to discuss Tibet, the stint ended in early retirement and beckoning obscurity. The touchstone of Satow's China policy in defense of its independence and territorial integrity was the Triple Alliance of Britain, Japan, and the United States. Once rapprochement of a sort had been achieved with the Empress Dowager, who Satow never entirely trusted, and she and her court had returned to Peking in early 1901, the situation stabilized. By September of that year, a somewhat punitive peace settlement with the Western powers had been come to, but for the most part the prospect of China's dismemberment seemed to have been eliminated. In particular, the United States was now taking the lead in championing the so-called open door in China, and Japan claimed also to support it. Satow's closest colleagues in these years were W. Rockhill and Edwin Conger for the United States, and the future Japanese Foreign Minister Uchida Yasuya. Germany and France, too, seemed to have scaled down their ambitions, but Russia declined to withdraw the troops it had sent to Manchuria during the Boxer crisis, and with the imminent conclusion of the Trans-Siberian Railway through to its new base at Port Arthur, it seemed more likely to extend its sway to Korea and also to North China proper. Some Japanese, having already envisaged the Sino-Japanese War as a trial run for a decisive contest with Russia, now began to plan for the latter. Extended negotiations in both capitals in no way diminished the apparent threat from what doubtless saw itself, certainly was widely viewed as, the world's leading power at the time. In a sense, Japan's temerity was extraordinary. As in 1941, war was undoubtedly a gamble, launched by means of a semi-surprise attack on Port Arthur in February 1904. Satow, like many other Britons, had privately urged the Japanese on, and was slower than some to have second thoughts when the America-mediated Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, brought the bloody conflict to a close 18 months later, as at least a Japanese moral victory. Russia was humiliated thereby and reduced to the second rank of powers, while Japan had gone from the small field, as Satow described it in the 1870s, to the equivalent perhaps of Portugal in the late 1880s, to what some saw as a great power in 1905. Regrettably, British opposition to Chinese legal sovereignty over Tibet had been abandoned for fear of adding to Russia's claims for compensation in Manchuria. Meanwhile, Satow registered the continuing rise of Japan with a series of perceptive private predictions. Already in the years after 1898, he repeatedly forecast that by 1903 Japan would be ready for its war with Russia. Following the war in December 1905, He was asserting surprisingly blithely, perhaps anticipating the notorious 21 demands of 1915. I give the world 10 years of peace in this part of the world. During that time, Japan will recoup her losses and be ready to begin again. By 1909, he was envisaging an attack on Hong Kong by Japan, ally or no, albeit in the context of British preoccupations in Europe. And by January 1921, he was agreeing with those who foresaw an eventual war between the United States and Japan if both countries continued to go on increasing their fleets. Thus, already by the spring of 1906, thanks to Japanese over-assertiveness in the aftermath of the Russian War, even he seems to have been doubting his previous hopes of Sino-Japanese cooperation. A somewhat unhappy visit to Japan en route home soon after evidently added to his doubts, while the circumstances of his premature retirement, with the option of transfer back to a Western embassy, preferably the one in Washington, never offered to him, left him generally frustrated. Tout vient à qui sait attendre, everything comes to he who waits, had long been his motto, and it had finally failed him. He had wanted to leave Peking, but ended up instead retired as a mere minister, with his career little recognized and no basis for any significant career at home either. For that matter, American attitudes, fueled by immigration controversy in California, initially anti-Chinese, were soon to turn fiercely anti-Japanese and justify attention to Eastern Asia right through to 1941. By contrast, although the region had just helped work a revolution in the affairs of Europe, that continent, including Britain, was virtually to forget East Asia until after the 1914-18 war, and old East Asian hands were to become voices crying in the wilderness, whatever their message. Satow's second career, the 1907 Hague Peace Conference. Satow's response, presumably considered carefully from the point at which he began to plan his return in late 1905, was to express no message, at any rate immediately. Even before he left China, he was declaring, "My ideal is to leave work to younger men, to enjoy the blessings of life so long as it is left to me to sit in a garden and read books written by other men." He insisted that my ambition, if ever I had any large measure of it, is quite dead, and rejected virtually all involvement with East Asian associations. At the Foreign Office, he merely confirmed the prospects of a renascent nationalist China, but said little of Japan. Meanwhile, he settled in East Devon, firstly at Sidmouth, and then, after 6 months, at Ottery St. Mary, and apparently tried to lose himself in local charity work and politics. His contemporary diaries are redolent with a determined satisfaction in his new semi-rural life. Yet East Devon was also easily accessible by rail from Babylon, as he termed London, if nowhere else much. And his early months back in England also feature a renewal of his scholarly interests in the form of work on the mid-19th century Austrian diplomat Baron Hübner, which was to culminate later in a Reed, R-E-D-E, lecture at Cambridge in 1908. At the instigation of the influential historian and editor of the Quarterly Review, George Protheroe, he prepared an article on the French Third Republic and chapters on the Far East for Lord Acton's Cambridge Modern History. Finally, in April 1907, quite out of the blue, he was invited by the Foreign Office to serve as Britain's second delegate to the imminent Second Hague Peace Conference. This was to prove a very time-consuming and ultimately highly frustrating responsibility, but one which served to regularize his position back home and to open up a variety of opportunities not normally available to veterans of the exotic Far East. For that matter, for Satow, the Second Hague Conference might have been so much more significant. It has not received the appreciation it merits. Admittedly, the only serious work the mandarins of Whitehall, like their counterparts of the Quai d'Orsay, Wilhelmstrasse, etc., seem to have envisaged the great 45-nation jamboree accomplishing was revising international maritime law in the light of the recent naval exchanges between Russia and Japan, where Satow, as a virtual first-hand observer, might have been expected to afford useful assistance. But unlike its 1899 predecessor, it involved representatives of some 20 South American republics who were not willing to defer to the great powers as had been the Asians from Japan, China, Siam, Persia, and Turkey. This was due substantially to encouragement from the United States, though not necessarily in ways appreciated in Washington either. The question of whether the conference should take on a permanent character as a kind of proto-League of Nations was seriously considered, but apparently blocked by the great powers. And in retrospect, it seems that the conference got quite near to making a major breakthrough in international relations, an outcome the Satow of this period, along with his co-delegates, Sir Edward Fry and Baron Rae, would probably have been only too delighted to assist. The same probably applied with their French colleagues, who included the former French Premier Léon Bourgeois to be one of the founding fathers of the League of Nations in 1919. And even the actual representatives of most of the other major powers also showed surprising sympathy with, or at least concern for, their popularity amongst the small powers. But all seem to have been accompanied by minders, who ensured that even the inner workings of the conference were constantly reported back to their respective governments. Satow and Rae, in particular, were constantly called to order by the rising heir Crow, who served as secretary to their delegation and corresponded independently with Whitehall. Sections of the British press were soon horrified by such an affair featuring smaller powers so prominently. And ultimately, Satow seems to have been hounded into proposing the postponement of many of the major issues to another conference, restricted largely to the major powers in London, opening the way for the termination of the Hague Conference in October 1907. As a result, he returned unobtrusively and almost ignominiously direct to his home in Ottery, as if his retirement from Peking had been delayed merely 1 year. Satow's second career, scholarship. Sadly, even Satow fell quickly into line with the swelling anti-German hysteria, fed in particular by the outcome of the Hague Conference, which in Britain was blamed exclusively on Germany. But he continued to be very active in local public affairs in East Devon, culminating in chairmanship of his local council during the 1914-18 war. He kept in touch with his two principal fellow delegates at The Hague, Fry and Rae, the latter of whom strongly disputed British foreign policy with particular respect to Germany, and he also gave important evidence to the Rae-Redesdale Treasury Committee that eventually gave rise to the establishment of the School of Oriental Studies, what we now call SOAS, the School of Oriental and Asian Studies. And such was his interest now in international law, provoked by his spell at The Hague and his confidence in his expertise with special respect to extraterritorial jurisdiction, that he contended quite seriously for some time for the chairs of international law at both Cambridge and Oxford. Unfortunately, he decided that the Oxford chair suited him the better. The vacancy came later, and the eminent appointment committee then concluded apparently that he was too old. But he was not too old to continue with his scholarship, and the competition he had offered in the quest for an academic chair was now to serve him well in finding publishing outlets. It was, in fact, early in 1914 that he met with L.G. Oppenheim, who had secured the Cambridge chair. Oppenheim had identified him as the ideal author of a study of diplomacy, to initiate a series to be published by Longmans on international law, in response to which Satow was able to insist that Oppenheim assist him in finding a publisher for the study he had already completed on the Silesian Loan and Frederick the Great. The latter appeared the following year from Oxford University Press to no great critical acclaim and soon sank into obscurity. By contrast, what was to appear as a 2-volume work in 1917, A Guide to Diplomatic Practice, thereafter always known simply as Satow, was to prove a classic, a veritable manual for the British Foreign Office as it passed through a series of editions, and for most unaware of his earlier Eastern career, what really kept his name alive. Nor did he rest even on these laurels. His interest in the prospects for a League of Nations and the post-war Paris Peace Conference, along with his connections with George Prothero, resulted in his compiling a government handbook on congresses and conferences, and in 1920 writing an article for the Quarterly Review on the reorganization of Europe. In the meanwhile, he had been busy with a private family memoir which took him back to his manuscript account of his 1860s experiences in Japan. When A Diplomat in Japan finally appeared in February 1921, it too was acclaimed and became for many years in both the West and Japan itself a standard work on what is a seminal period in Japanese history. It did not, however, do anything to diminish the growing desire in London to terminate the 20-year-old Anglo-Japanese alliance, nor was it intended to do so. Accordingly, in favor of closer Anglo-American ties and restrictions on naval construction programs, the alliance was effectively cancelled at the Washington Naval Conference at the end of the year, and Japan cast back into isolation. For Satow, his days there were now part of a long-lost age, and even his links with his younger son, who always called himself Takeda Hisayoshi and had visited England in 1910 to 1916 to study botany, his tubercular elder son had migrated to the United States and assumed there the name Alfred Satow, did not seem to mean much to him. He was now thoroughly re-Anglicized, and Japan was far away and inaccessible. Only the great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which his Tokyo family survived unscathed, his wife Kane was also to outlive him, seems to have restored a degree of concern and interest. The whole of his own experience of Japan had never featured one significant earthquake. And his protege and friend, J.H. Gubbins, John Harrington Gubbins, apparently as a kind of cooperative work, produced soon after Satow's Diplomat the survey of the country's modern development that some commentators thought his own book should have been. Satow's last 8 years appear to have been fairly uneventful. One feature of them was annual visits from Ottery to Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where his Erasmian scholar-nephew Percy Allen had been elected president, and where he could delight in academic society as never before. The other main one was an association with the leading interwar international historian Harold Temperley, who had edited his contributions in the Cambridge Modern History in the early days of his retirement. Temperley employed him to read many of his own writings during the 1920s and consulted him on a variety of points of detail regarding Western international relations. And in 1925, in return, he arranged the publication of Satow's last essay on international law in the new Cambridge Historical Journal, which he had just founded. Some of Satow's private writings were also incorporated into the Gooch and Temperley series of the Documents on British Foreign Policy. On occasion, Satow protested at Temperley's neglect of Eastern affairs, but the times were not propitious for such attention, and his own concern for the East now went no further. Even by the time he died in August 1929, only limited enough warning was being felt of the importance Eastern Asian affairs were so shortly to assume during the 1930s. See also this is Nigel Brailey, is the person here who's talking. See also Sir Ernest Satow, Japan and Asia, The Trials of a Diplomat in the Age of High Imperialism, Cambridge Historical Journal, volume 33, I think that is, yes, number 1, 1992, pages 115 to 150. Protection or Partition, Ernest Satow and the 1880s Crisis in Britain's Siam Policy, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, volume 29? Or is it 39? Sorry, the scan is not very good. Number 1, March 1998, pages 1 to 23. I'm responsible for the scan, by the way. Introduction to Ernest Satow, A Diplomat in Siam, Gartmore Sterling, 1996. N.J. Brailey edited the Satow Siam Papers, Bangkok, 1997 to, actually unfinished, I think. And forthcoming, N.J. Brailey, Sir Ernest Satow and his book, A Diplomat in Japan, in the Proceedings of the Japan Society, London. And N.J. Brailey, Sir Ernest Mason Satow in the New Dictionary of National Biography. So both of those were published, I know. Nigel Brailey, University of Bristol, 1998. And you can see on the next page the start of Kwaiwa Hen, 25 exercises in the Edo colloquial for the use of students with notes. Ernest Satow, Japanese secretary to Her Majesty's legation in Japan, Yokohama, Lane, Crawford and Company, 1873. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and I think it is an excellent summary of Satow's career, life and career, I should say. And yeah, I read that because I thought Nigel deserved to be remembered in this way, and I hope he would feel that this was a good way to remember him. There's no talk, or there's no possibility of a Festschrift or other academic honor, I don't think. So that's my best effort uh, at doing something to remember him. All right. So thank you very much if you have persevered up until this point. And I look forward to seeing you again fairly soon with another reading, either of Satow or something connected with William Adams and John Saris in the 17th century, or a variety of other topics that I get involved in or get interested in. So thank you very much. I will stop the recording now.